presenter for this session. This definitely not hour-long session. It won't be, well, I shouldn't say that. I don't have an hour planned. We'll go a little shorter, but my intent is to leave time for questions, discussion. I like to engage. Those who know me know, if you've taken a class from me, I definitely like to have a little more back and forth, and not just give an opportunity for you to ask questions, but for me to hear from you. And that's a way that I learn as well. So
We're also recording this, so we'll have it on our YouTube if
oh,
anyone's
great.
interested. Yeah, so behave.
Yeah, you should all get information about that afterwards as well. You should have plenty of access. I'm also going to, hopefully in this session specifically, leave you with some tools and some other things to do. Almost, not so much homework, but I want you to be able to take some of this and run with it and play around. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later. But as Christy did, I'm going to do a little housekeeping as well. Some of this might overlap with some of what she said, but that's we want to make sure we drive some things home. First of all, this session is technically a support-aware webinar. Support-aware, as most of you should be aware, is a service of Atlantic Data Security. It is a suite of offerings. It's things that we do to try and offer better service to our clients, to our customers like yourselves. I'm not going to bore you with all of this. There is plenty of well-documented detail on our site. Most of you probably know this stuff already, so I'm not, as I said, not going to linger on this. But this is one of the, we don't have a bullet for it, but one of the services and one of the things we're trying to add for support-aware customers like yourselves. And also the upcoming events. I always like to, whenever I do these, mention what is coming up. If we did this, or if you talked to me yesterday, today's would have been one of those coming events. This webinar itself. Next week's actually a busy week. We're spread across Rochester, out in Western New York. Western upstate's kind of in between Rochester, for the Rochester Security Summit. And of course, our little after event, I shouldn't say little, we're actually doing we're calling it an extraordinaire. So if you hit our website and the events page, that QR code will bring you right to the events page. You can see more details on this. Click to register for any of it. Of course, more local to me and where I will be next week is on Wednesday, CPX 360, of course, in Foxborough, actually at Gillette Stadium. If you haven't been there, just to go there is kind of cool. If you stick around at the end, there'll be a stadium tour, and definitely an informative and educational event here in the Boston area. Later on the month, again in this area, actually a little closer to me, out in Marlborough, Mass, the Threat Defense Challenge with Trend Micro. That's going to be a potentially very fun and very interesting, also possibly nerve-wracking event for us. And then in Buffalo, we have Cybersecurity and Cocktails event coming up also at the end of the month. I want to say right at the end of the month. And then, of course, we'll tease very early for December because this will fill up. We are, of course, doing our screenings of the latest and hopefully not last, but last in the series of 9 episodes of Star Wars movies. And we're doing Buffalo, Boston, Boston area, Hartford, and Portland, Maine this year. So make sure you click, go register and sign up for those as well. Not liking to be a sales guy or a marketing guy. Let me move on and get into the agenda for today. First of all, who am I? If you don't know who I am, that's fine. I'm assuming at least a good number of you don't. I am Eric Anderson. I am engineer, part of the engineering team here at Atlantic Data Security. I also am an instructor. I've been working with Checkpoint for a very long time. It's been a very exciting few years as we've seen all these new changes in R80. So if you've spoken with any of our engineering team, you're aware of that. You're likely aware of it anyway. And the Support Aware seminar series is intended to help bring some more technical kind of, I like to think, cool stuff to the forefront and present and hopefully, like today, demonstrate some of the interesting things that maybe you haven't seen. We had a number of these last year. We try to do them quarterly. It doesn't always work out that way. But my goal is to deliver something technical. I'm not going to pitch anything. I'm not going to sell anything. I don't want to show you what you can buy. It's something you should all already have. And as of, I believe, next Monday, most, if not all of you, should be on R80.10 or newer because 77's end of support, of course, happens, I believe, still the end of September. So it shouldn't be much of an issue as to whether or not you can utilize what we're about to talk about. So the agenda, as I said, I don't want to drag things out. I want to use a bunch of examples, and I ultimately want to get into some live stuff and show you how to demo and play with this on your own in the future, whenever you'd like as well. So I'm going to start with a quick review of a session we did, and I am going to repurpose some slides and some content from a session we did last year, talking about the management API, sort of an introduction. I want to do this because I know many of you weren't here for that anyway, didn't hear that piece of it, and it's important background just to kind of get everybody started. And I want to demystify and kind of not dumb down, but I want to make sure you understand what we're talking about here. And the API doesn't have to be a scary term. And then I want to get into the piece that we kind of ended that short of. When we had that discussion, I'll again get us back to that really, really quickly, and then show that more advanced kind of cooler piece of API batch scripting and how you can take some very, very large, otherwise daunting tasks and make them a little bit easier, a little bit less daunting, but also a little bit more foolproof, reducing the potential for making mistakes and errors. And I want to do that live. I find it a little more thrilling, a little more exciting, a little more challenging, a little more risky, but hopefully you appreciate it. And everything I'm going to do it in a way that you can do it as well. And I'll tell you what I mean when I get there. I have a couple of notes I want to make sure and leave you with at the end of that. But as I said, I want to leave plenty of room for some Q&A. I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear, either just comments. Yes, I've done this, I've done that. That was fun. Or how would I do this? How could I accomplish this other task? And we can, of course, always take that stuff offline as well. You can engage myself, other members of our engineering team, especially, if there's something more complex or specific you want to get into. And a lot of this, of course, many of you have do that already. So anyway, let me start off. I like to start anytime I talk about the API. People have this fear because when we hear API, we often think of what Wikipedia says an API is, and it's that concept of application programming interface. We think it's for programming, and it doesn't have to be. The simple examples we used last year, I tried to point out to people that even in Checkpoint's API reference document, and this is a website you can pull up easily, they mention that this is for system admins who want to improve productivity by scripting stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to write a third-party product that we're going to sell and market that ties into Checkpoint. It can, and the new API introduced and already makes that much easier for those vendors, but that's not the primary goal. You see the very first bullet is the one that I'm talking about. This is for us. This is for people administering Checkpoint without programming backgrounds. What I'm going to get into starts to get a little more advanced than what we talked about last year, but you'll see it doesn't have to be scary. I want everybody to think and see how this can be used. And again, I mentioned I'm repurposing slides. I'm not going to linger on these as long as I did when I was presenting this new, but I do want everyone to kind of get these basics. We touched on at that first session how the API is used by developers using HTTPS puts and gets and other information in JSON calls to write more advanced code. Then we spent time mostly looking at the simplified ways of doing things. We can issue API calls and do things in 3 other ways that are more geared at admins. The Smart Console CLI itself, and I'm going to pull up slides to show that again very quickly. Then there's the Gaia CLI, again, tied into Checkpoint. This is from within a Checkpoint OS, but then what I'm going to spend more time on today is the MGMT CLI binary, which can be run completely outside of Checkpoint devices. Doesn't have to be run on Gaia. You can run this on a Windows box. You can run it on a generic Linux box. And that's what I want to focus on because that gives you additional power to write more advanced scripts and to use other sources of data like CSVs. Again, we'll touch on it. Quickest, easiest way to run some scripts right within the management CLI. We talked about how when we log into the management Smart Console, that automatically creates a session for us, all of our session tracking, which we need to make any changes within the management server. That session is created and maintained just by logging into Smart Console. I can log in and open up that command line interface, which is that second little icon from the bottom left in Smart Console. Clarifying again, this has nothing to do with Gaia. This is not a real command line. This is an API command line. It's a CLI that allows you to issue simple API commands, like changing the color of an object. And this is just a simple shot of an example of changing the color of an object by typing exactly what I typed right there. Very simple concept. Then I expanded it to, well, what if we have a list of hosts? And this is where we're going to go to a more advanced example of this very, very quickly. But say I had a list of host objects. I want to create these in the system. I could effectively make a non-script script. And this is really, I'd say non-script because this is really just series of separate commands that I'm not even going to use. Well, I'm sort of going to use as a script here. All I did was took the host names and IP addresses and added syntax columns to make each row into a command that I want to add the host with this name and this IP address. Then I could save this as a simple space delimited text file. So each one of these just reads as a line. I can go to my API. So I open up the Object Explorer in the background, look for any objects with the name host.anything. There weren't any. And then I selected the little file import icon in the API command line in Smart Console. I could have copied and pasted line by line, but by selecting that text file and importing it here, I get better syntax and better flow of actually processing and parsing through that file. It ran each of those commands, created those host objects on the fly, very easy to see as it happened. And this was all again done within my session. You can do the same thing, as I said, in the Gaia command line as well. This can almost become a script, but again, with Gaia in Clish, we're not actually able to access files. So we can't actually trigger a script from the Gaia command line, but I can paste these commands or run these commands from another device that's connecting to Clish over PuTTY. And I could then run these commands remotely that way. One of the things that we have to do if we're in Clish, we have to create our session. We have to log in. We haven't authenticated to Smart Console. Remember, we've logged into Gaia. That's just an operating system. We don't necessarily have access into the firewall management software yet. So our first command has to be to log in, pass parameters, username, password, and then we could run those same script commands. So exactly what I'd done in the previous example, I could have a script here that actually logs in, maybe creates a session name, sets a description, and then adds those same host objects, but all from without even having to log into Smart Console. Simple example. And then, and I did this fairly quickly, get to the last example I briefly touched on in that earlier session, and that's writing scripts outside of any Checkpoint platform at all. The challenge we had here, remember, is I have to create a session, but now I have to track that session as well. When I'm running commands from within Smart Console or even in Clish, my session is tracked for me, my API session, and I'm going to show this more graphically and more visually in just a minute. But when I first log in to a management server, if I'm not on a Checkpoint platform, either Smart Console or Clish, when I log in, it displays for me, it outputs a session identifier once I've authenticated. That session identifier, I can simply pipe the output into a file. And then on all of my successive commands that do anything to the API, when I run my MGMT CLI, I can pull the session identifier out of that file with the -s parameter. And I'm going to show you an example of this. We're going to build a script together that does not exactly this, but something similar. We're going to build it from scratch together. This was the final slide in that content of that previous presentation. And this is where it kind of ended, talking about that last bullet where we talk about using CSV files or other lists to get our input from. And that's where we're going to pick up now. And we're going to kind of focus on taking some form of data. And that's really our first question. Where's the data going to come from? Where are we going to get this? And there's all different sources. We've got examples where maybe some vendor or some compliance officer or some supplier might give you a list of destination URLs, destination IP addresses, source IP addresses, whether it's hosts, whether it's groups, whether it's, again, even URLs and other components. I'm going to use hosts as an example because we can all visualize that and see that. And it's one of the more common things we've run into as an engineering organization, is being given these large lists that one of our clients may need to get into Checkpoint, get populated. And it's easy for most to grasp. So I'm going to use that as an example. Other questions is this a one-time job? Is this something we're just doing now? We've done this many, many times over the past with clients, especially years back, who are migrating to, let's say, R80 or R80.10 at the time, coming from older versions or potentially even coming from other products outside of Checkpoint. You may have large lists of hosts, groups, even rules, and various components that you may want to import just one time. It's not going to be a recurring piece. That's a different task than setting something up that's going to be regular, on a very regular basis. We may have a simple script as the one we're going to create, which references a specific CSV file and says, go ahead and take everything that's in there and process it. whether that's creating new objects or modifying existing objects, populating groups, and so forth. That just becomes a function of how you end up using that script and whether or not you need to make it more generic or you're just going to run it as a one-off. The other thing that I want to show, and where I'm going to do my demonstration here, is that we can use demo mode as a way to learn and play and experiment. Now, we can always, of course, have our own offline lab environments. And usually when I do these sessions, and for those of you who've worked with me, I like to use our own lab gear, whether it's our training lab or our other engineering lab stuff, and do things with our own systems that I know are faster and I can have pre-configured with other stuff. But what I wanted to do in this session is I want to empower you to be able to do exactly what I'm about to do, whether it's showing your colleagues, showing your boss, showing off, or just to test your own scripts. And you can do this without, if you don't have the luxury of some great lab gear like we do, you can do this by using Checkpoint. And you can leverage what Checkpoint has to make this all pretty straightforward. So my first question, and I'm not going to ask everybody, but the first question is everyone familiar with demo mode? And again, I'm not going to wait for responses. That's not the kind of question I mean. But demo mode, for those who are familiar, when you launch any Checkpoint GUI client, there's a checkbox there for demo mode. And instead of logging in to an actual management server, when you say demo mode, this is going to go out to Checkpoint and register for one of their many available cloud-based management servers that just sits there kind of waiting for you to connect to it. And by saying start a new demo and log in, this is going to automatically connect, create a session, give me my session identifier here, not a session identifier, my instance identifier for my demo mode. And it's going to set an expiration of 3 hours out. When I say continue, that's fine. It gives me the fingerprint, which of course I can't really verify because I don't have that server. But I'm going to continue, and it's going to launch R80.30 in this case is what I'm using in this sample environment. And it's pre-populated with objects, rules, gateways that don't really exist. They aren't real. And I'm doing this on the fly. That you saw, just as proof, I created a new session. I haven't populated any of this myself. None of this is pre-baked. The only things I'm going to show you that are pre-baked are some files that I have kind of ready to go. So here's my demo mode. Now I can look around policies. I can go ahead and play with different things, importing via the non-API methods. The big question now comes, how do I run things in the API? The command line API is very easy. We can launch this, again, right within our Smart Console session, and I could start adding objects via the basic scripting commands inside of Smart Console. This is also, of course, a great way to launch the API reference. If you want to be able to look at how to structure commands, some of the syntax of different commands, clicking this button here is going to launch. I have this pre-baked as well, already running. I have the 80.30 version running here. This is, of course, whoops, and of course my machine wants to flake out on me. This is the API reference document. Different versions coincide with the version of Smart Console that you launch it from. They are R80.10.20.m1, .20.20.m2, and now, of course, .30. The only thing they do is add new syntax and new commands, typically for new types of objects that are added. If you use an older version of the API reference, you're just going to help be more compliant, or your script will be more compliant with that older version. But if you wanted to use new features that are available in new versions, they might not work in previous versions. I don't want to linger on that even. If we go back to my demo mode, in my command line. I'm not going to make commands in this one again either. What I want to do, again, is focus on that method of running API commands from completely outside of Smart Console. But with demo mode, typically the only way I can get into it is with Smart Console. But I'm going to show you how you can mess with this, and I can use this demo mode session to even run API commands. Now, the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to need to have an administrative account that we can log into. When you work within demo mode, it's all kind of controlled for you. Accounts are predefined. They have passwords that we don't even know. I don't know what they are. Somebody might. If anyone of our guys does, let me know. But it's very easy to get around. What I like to do is take Walter here, and for anyone who's a Breaking Bad fan, you'll recognize Checkpoint's demo mode pre-configured admin accounts. But I like to set the password for Walter. Again, this is a new demo mode session. I haven't messed with it yet at all. I'm going to change Walter's password to something that I do know. And I'm just going to use White. We'll do all lowercase White. So it's Walter White. And I can say go ahead. And of course, have to publish that session. So now my demo mode session, my new demo mode, the admin named Walter, which is case sensitive, has a lowercase password of white. Pretty easy, straightforward enough. I go and look at the sessions I have running. I can see my session here as admin, logged in. But now if I want to run API commands and I want to populate demo mode here with a whole bunch of host objects, I'm going to have to call that API and point it to a host. If you remember those commands for logging in, I'll actually bring it back up a second. If we went to our API reference and looked at session login, it tells us, yes, we have to run mgmti CLI with a login command, and we're going to have to give a user and password. And that's what I just made predictable. I know what Walter's password is. But the other thing I have to do, because I'm going to run this from my Windows machine, by the way, I'm going to run these API commands from a command box in Windows. I need to know the server I'm connecting to. And demo mode actually makes that possible by presenting server information right within this little menu at the bottom. This is different every time you start a new demo mode session. But I can copy that server IP address to the clipboard, and I will show you what that is just in Notepad here. I can paste it. There's my demo mode IP address. In fact, I can even copy the host name, not that I'm going to use it. I can throw that out here as well. I actually want the IP address though, because I want to make a script that issues commands to my demo mode session. So if I, whoops, get rid of that. What I have, I said I pre-configured a few things. My batch file, I'm actually going to run the script from, doesn't have anything in it yet. This is empty. We are going to create that. That's our task. To do so, bear with me as I move some windows around. What I also have is a list of hosts. I have this list of 20 host machines with their IP addresses, and I've pre-configured this a little bit as well, pre-baked it, but you can see the syntax here is pretty straightforward. You can add a whole bunch of different columns as well. If there are other data points, other things you want. If you want these members to be, or these hosts to be members of a group, you can specify groups in a column as well and list the group that you want them to be a member of. One caveat there, the group must already exist. So for example, in the past, we've done batches for our customers. We're bringing in this database from a completely different server. And they've got hundreds of host objects, maybe thousands of host objects, and we want to import those. And we've gotten them, as I said, from different sources. Maybe we got a dump out of a CSV file from another product, or from, if anyone's been around Checkpoint long enough, remembers ODumper, old Perl scripts that would allow you to parse out the old objects.c file, grab all that information, put it in a comma delimited file. We could then massage and group it out. When we do this import, and you'll see it when we build the command, we're going to specify a host command. We're going to actually import hosts. That would have to be a separate API command from importing groups, networks, address ranges, rules. They would all be handled separately. So if I have that dump, that source file, here I'm creating my host file. If we were using group parameters here, we would have to have imported the groups first, so that when we create the objects and specify groups, it actually works. So one little note there, and we can dive into this when we get into questions and look at more detail. But what I have is this large list of host files. They could have different colors, different descriptions. I just made this easy on myself when creating this simple batch. And ultimately, I want to create these, but I want to do it with a batch file just because I can. Another thing you'll notice in the folder that I'm going to be working in, and this is where I am right here in my command prompt, I have mgmt_cli.exe. And all I did was cheat and copied this from the program files folder. I have Smart Console installed on this machine, obviously. And from within program files, x86, Checkpoint, Smart Console, R80.30 program, there's a bunch of executables in there, including Smart Console and all the other goodies. MGMT CLI is installed there by default as part of Smart Console. Now you could add it to your path. You could specify that path when you run the command line. Just to make things easy on myself, I copied the executable here into the folder that I'm going to create my batch file in. Now again, this can also be done in Linux. Typically, it's a little bit more difficult if it's a non-checkpoint box. I've heard that that's being worked on. I'll talk about that in my kind of what's coming to try and make the Linux execution easier. But when we talk about running these on Linux, we're usually referring to management server or even a gateway, where you've got Gaia running. The MGMT CLI is a built-in binary there, and you can run the exact same command with the exact same syntax on a Linux box. We often lose sight of the fact, though, that I could do this from Windows as well, and that's why I want to show it this way. First of all, it's easier because I'm not logging into the Smart Console demo mode machine, because I can't. They protect that, but I can run this MGMT CLI right in my Windows machine in my Windows batch file. You could use PowerShell. You could use whatever it is that you'd like to do scripting within Windows. And I think that's an often underused aspect of it. So that's why I'm going to do it. So we have that executable here. We have potentially some CSVs or text files or other forms of data here. And like I said, the one I'm using is simply this list of hosts formatted with simple columns. The headers define what each of those columns is, and this comes from that API reference. If I were to look here and wanted to add an additional component, if I go look at my network objects for adding hosts, my syntax is all here. I have to have a name. I have to have an IP address. If you notice my CSV file, I've actually specified IPv4 address. It can either just be IP address, it'll figure it out, or you can specify. We can also put in all this other information if we're natting, if we want to assign tags, which you'll notice I have a tag assigned to each of these. We can find our comments as well. So the first thing is to make sure that we have all of our column headers correct. If I said, for example, comment instead of comments, it would error out on me. But we're hoping that this will all work when I do it live. And then each one of these, of course, has all the data. So if I now want to build this batch file to run this script for me, I'll use Notepad++. And I'm going to go step by step. First of all, we have to run our MGMT CLI, our binary. And as I mentioned, the first command we're going to have to give it as a login. So the first line of my script is to log in, effectively creating a session and authenticating to this management server, this demo mode management server. I can do that with the -m command and then paste that IP address, which fortunately is still in my clipboard, of the demo mode server that I've connected to. I then have to log in, and I can specify user Walter, again, case sensitive on the admin account, and specify the P for password, White. As I mentioned, that was lowercase. Now, the other parameter I'm going to use here in my example is to deal with the fact that the first time I run a script, it presents me a fingerprint, and it does this via console. So if I run this manually, it presents the fingerprint, and I have to verify and say yes, okay, or no, not. To avoid that in this script, I'm going to give it a parameter called unsafe, true. And that says, I don't care if the cert's valid or not. I'm not going to validate the fingerprint. Just go ahead no matter what the fingerprint says. Simple way around that. Now, the really key part to this, when I'm running scripts, checkpoint management API scripts from some random external box, I have to take that session identifier that's given back to me in standard output as a response and dump that into a file. I typically call it id.txt. Now, if you notice, right now my folder that all this is in, there is no file, but I'm going to run this all from within this folder. When I run the script, it should create that file for me. You'll see how we use it in a second. So presuming the script works properly, and again, we could test this line by line. I could go in and actually, you know what, I'll do it. We'll just run that command manually from my command prompt to make sure that I'm communicating properly with, and why didn't it copy? Copy. And it's not pasting. Oh, never mind. I'll just type it manually. Same thing, CLI login, -m 35.168.23.107. And you could also do this piece by piece. If I just start with this, it should then prompt me for the name and password, and I'll see that information. I could type Walter, and I could type my password White. It's going to validate the fingerprint, allow me to say yes, and it's going to spit out the output directly to the console. And you can see that SID is that session identifier that we then need to reference in all of the other commands we run. That's what I don't want to have to deal with. And by dumping that out to the id.txt, it's going to be in a file that I can pull in with my other commands. So it's just verified that I can log into that server, that this all works. And you can test each line command by just typing it here. But I want to make this run automatically, first run. So we're going to continue our script. And remember from the previous examples, what I was able to do was add hosts with individual commands, add host, and then specify the parameters line by line. Add host, give it a name and an IP address using proper parameters on this line. But what I want to do is a batch. And there's a very simple command. If I want to import a batch file from a CSV file, I simply specify -b and then name the file. I'm going to double check the name of my file. It should be this sa demo.host.csv or -host.csv. In fact, I'll copy it just because I can. That's the file I want to import from. And it's just a simple comma delimited file. I don't have to look at it in Excel. I can show you right in Notepad. This is what it looks like. Simple commas. You notice I have spaces in my comments. That's totally fine because it's still delimited by the commas. Where you would run into an issue is if your comment had a comma, which it could, then you would need to have quotes around this as well. There's certain other characters that that might break the import process as well, so having quotes around it doesn't hurt. And you could, of course, manipulate that in Excel if you'd like. But that's the file I want to import. So the -b command and the name of that file says, pull all my hosts that I want to import from here. Now, again, I'm going to specify unsafe because we don't want to worry about that cert. And then this is that piece that we talked about using the session identifier. I can simply say -s, pull the session ID from id.txt. That's the file that I want to import my session ID from. And that's what allows this command to execute as part of my session, the session that I created in the first line. Now, if I were to run this command right now, or run this script right now, it should log in, create the session, run the command, pull in all those hosts, create them, but then exit without closing the session, not even logging out. I'm going to do that actually. Let's do this live. Let's go run my command. We will run our batch file. And whoops, I called it batchhost.bat. Now, in theory, if I did this right, it should execute, take a few seconds as it logs in, creates a session, creates all these hosts for me, and then it's going to exit out without any output. I could have output. I could use JSON. I could do all kinds of really cool things to get more display. But if I'm writing this as an automated task, especially something that's going to occur occasionally, periodically, using a random CSV file, I don't necessarily want that input spit out to the screen. I just want it to execute and end. We can pull simple results of success or failure or errors. But now to prove that this worked, and because I'm just writing this script, I don't necessarily want to make anything change or publish those changes yet. My script right now just makes the changes, and what's happened to them? If I go back and look at my session here, if I go look at my objects, and I go trying to find where they are, I go down to my network objects, my hosts, there's only 11 of them, and they're all the things that were predefined by Checkpoint. My ADS hosts aren't there. But if I look at my session information behind here, I can see that API session. Here's the first one that I created when I logged in and I didn't log out. I can quickly discard that session. But if I look at this top session here, this shows that Walter has 21 locks and changes. He's done some stuff. If I want to review that manually, take a look at what the API, that batch did before I publish, I can take over that session manually as admin, which is who I logged into initially with demo mode. That's just the way they do it. And that's going to make Walter's changes mine. It effectively closes out Walter's session, disconnects him, so that login is now invalid. But now you can see my session counter at the top shows I have 21 unpublished changes. If I go open up my objects and go looking for my hosts, you can see all those ADS host objects were imported. They're all here. I could now publish this, and those would all become available objects, and other administrators could see them. I could start using them in policy. However, let's say there was an issue and one of them didn't actually work right. I had some sort of error. I wanted to do more. I can also, of course, discard this session, either this way or via the top button, and run the script again. And this is how we practice. This is a great way to make slight modifications, try and get the script to run perfectly without actually making changes that are going to be impactful immediately. So if I discard that, back down to 0, no harm, no foul, the objects aren't there. If I do my search for ADS objects, there's nothing. So now let's go back to my script. Now that we know it works, we're confident that it's doing what we want it to. We want to actually make that script automatically publish. So we're going to add one final line to the script that says, yep, go ahead and make it so. Do this, run through the process, push the changes out. I will save that. We'll execute the script again. And now, well, I'll wait. I'll let it run. As we saw, it only takes a few seconds because I'm only doing 20 hosts. Demo mode is generally going to be a little slower than a well-performing, properly sized management server running locally. So I'm doing this from a Windows machine out to Checkpoint's cloud, wherever this demo mode server is running. It's not Checkpoint's cloud. I believe it's AWS. But there is a little bit of a delay in doing this. So we'll give it its few seconds. It should create the hosts. Hopefully not make a liar out of me. And then publish. And it's publishing, giving me a little status while it does it. And then we go. And publish succeeded. You can see the JSON output that comes back out. All kinds of wonderful information comes back to me, basically saying that it succeeded. Everything went well. So now if I go back here, you think I'm going to see something? Look at that. All those hosts were created and published. They're actually there and available for use now. The idea is to extrapolate this and kind of envision this doing more. I'm using a relatively simple example that we can all kind of relate to, creating a large batch of hosts. It could be much larger. This is actually not that large. This is a pretty small number of hosts. But we have all kinds of interesting cases where, and again, the source of the data, where it's coming from, can be varied. It could be a simple migration. It could be a list you have from some other product, other source, older firewall, acquired organization, or a new firewall coming in, and you just want to get that data in here. However you get the data in, you can use these batches to recreate it. I think the more interesting long-term example is when this is a regular occurrence, when we have things being done repeatedly. We're constantly adding to it, adding to the list, and making things even more, or making it more repetitive. We go back here. We can, of course, see Walter is still in. And one of the things I didn't do in my script, which would be a best practice, is to log out. Now, I could do that manually here by running mgmt CLI, log out, and simply pull in my session identifier. Now it's logged out. Now you can see the session is gone. Best practice would have been for me to, and I don't like to not do best practice, is to actually log out at the end of the script. So that would be a better way to do this. But that's it. It's clean. If I go back and look at my revisions now, and one of the things I didn't do is provide session identifier or a session name and comment. Of course, best practice, but I'm trying to do a very quick script and show simple examples. Anyway, one other thing I want to show while we're here, just in demo mode, because again, the idea is you can do this, you can play with demo mode, you can beat it up, you can create a whole bunch of objects that you don't like. You can either discard or just close it and open up a new demo mode session and pull the IP address right out of that session. So you can play with these scripts. You can use exactly what I used. If you want, I'll go ahead and reach out after the session. I'll give you these exact files. I'll give you the script I just created if you want to use it as a baseline for starting to play with these things. But let me bounce back to PowerPoint for just a second. What I did want to show, sorry, that's what I was going in there to remind myself. If we wanted to get an example of what, or see an example of what we can get out of, or where we can get sources of information, if we had, let's say it was a separate server, I wanted to export the objects that I have in that management server. Right from our Objects Explorer, there's actually an export entry. From whatever section I'm looking at, whether it's hosts, address ranges, I can export that. It's going to generate a CSV file for me. And I could say exported host.csv. It'll create that file for me. I can actually then open that right in Excel, which is what it should do. And here's the one that I exported. And if you look at this, the column headers are exactly correct, except modifier and last modified, I probably wouldn't import. So if I wanted to make this into a script to import these host objects on another machine, I'm kind of close. What I don't have is IP address. I didn't export it, and this is really not the best example because it doesn't get everything. But the idea would be you can get information from various sources, and Checkpoint is just one of them itself. Really more using other scripts or deeper scripts, or using the same idea with batch files. Instead of adding objects, you can get objects, and you can retrieve that information and dump it into other files. So again, with the time we have and wanting to leave some time for questions and comments and not keep anyone from being here too long, that was the bulk of what I wanted to show. A couple big notes though. One of the other things we've seen is large batches, and you'd be surprised how often we end up having these that are over 500 lines or objects at a time. There are some known issues, and we like to keep it under 500. In fact, there are parameters you can specify on that import with that -B that says stop after 500. The other thing you can see in some versions, and this also has to do with sizing of the management server, is publishing more than 500 changes at a time can in some cases be a little problematic. It's not a common thing. It's very rare. I would ask you, what's the most changes you've published at once? And it's probably less than 100. So we want to keep things under 500. You can make your scripts adapt to that, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Also keep in mind, you can test this and play with it even on your production servers without publishing. If you don't publish, you can make all the changes you want. You can see how the script executes, see if there are errors, and then review things by taking over the session and discarding, throwing all the changes out and trying again. And utilize demo mode as I showed. It should be pretty available and for different versions. If you're running different versions of management, you can still support different versions of, as long as your Smart Console, you check demo mode and it's semi up to date. Sometimes the minor version changes of Smart Console become incompatible with demo mode, but it should be there. I also want to comment on a couple of things that we know are coming. And not a whole what's new, what's down the road, but specifically for the API. If anyone has heard, of course, .30 is now mainstream. That's kind of where everybody's at now. It's really the, I simply want to say most common and most prolific version right now. It's what most new deployments are anyway. Doesn't mean everyone has to be there. And if you're not, you're in trouble. .20 is probably still the most common, but we're doing more and more new deployments with .30. There are some interesting new features. A lot of it's around stability. .40 has been announced. I shouldn't say announced. They don't actually have a release date. It is in limited EA. They are soliciting customers. I'm not recommending for anyone yet, but some of the features that are coming in .40 have been discussed, have been made semi-public. They are likely to be in the product from what I've heard, but not all necessarily will make it. There are a couple compelling ones. The one thing I'll mention as a side note that's exciting to me, this is completely unrelated to today's topic, but one of the neat new features coming is finally the introduction of VPN encryption domains or VPN domains per community, per gateway. And for anyone that I've taught in the past, that we've talked about VPNs, one of Checkpoint's, I don't want to say limitations because there have been ways around it, has been that each gateway only has one VPN domain setting, even if it's in multiple different communities that maybe want to talk to different things. And .40 is introducing finally a more granular option. That said, the more applicable piece is the API continues to advance and expand, and .40 will continue in that, and not only add new types of objects, not new objects that are being introduced in R40 in general, but in the API, I said R40, .40, in the API itself, they're adding the capability to manipulate cluster objects and theoretically gateways as well. That's been one of the limitations up to now. Not that we're going to script the creation of 500 gateways, but that's going to become more possible. They're also talking about .40 having some ability to do update CPUs type things for central deployment or hotfix accumulators to control some of that installing and upgrading via APIs, which becomes an interesting scripting option as well. They're also talking about this new feature, I believe they're calling smart tasks at this point, which allow us to make simply triggered tasks like session publication and policy installs a little bit more easily without even calling scripts as we saw it, as a task kind of automated within Smart Console and controlled more graphically for those that are scared by command lines or scared by writing text files. And the other one that I think is very interesting, especially when we're talking about automated tasks like I just showed, is authentication via an automatically generated API key, as many products start to use. A lot of websites and other things have their own proprietary API keys that you can feed other products or other command lines to tie in more securely. So that API key is going to be part of the product in .40 as well. So there are some neat new things coming down the road that'll continue to enhance this type of capability. How are we for time? I think we did okay. I haven't seen any questions come in. I'm taking a look now. Typed questions within the Q&A section, but I definitely want to give people an option or an opportunity to do that before we have to end things. I'm always curious what people are doing with the API and with scripts. Who has done anything with batch jobs? And this is, again, still relatively simple, high level with the time we have. What we may end up doing with our next session or somewhere down the road is diving in even deeper and talking about more enhanced or intelligent scripting language itself, where we use the output a little bit more and have the script fork and do different things based on the results we get as we start to query objects and format things with jQuery, JSON query. That gets into a whole nother level, but now we've got the baseline to maybe move on to that in a future session. Questions, thoughts, concerns, ideas? Go ahead and type them. Anyone? Crickets.
Bueller.
Everyone's overwhelmed or bored.